Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Andrea Letamendi. Hello, Andrea.
Hi, Brian.
This week we are back, and it's funny because this episode is actually one that I've read in a number of places over the last couple of years, actually, that this is Bruce Timm's least favorite episode of Batman the Animated Series.
So this is the worst episode of not just the animated series, but the entire DC animated universe.
That's according to a couple of sources. Now, I've never been able to track any of these back to the original source. So I've never been able to find this interview where Bruce Timm has openly said that the terrible trio was his least favorite of the DC animated universe. But I did notice, especially in doing some research on this episode, that in 3 or 4 different places, he is quoted as saying this is his least favorite. Although I don't think it's a bad one for what we need it to do. Would you agree? Like, you know, it's got some nice psychology in it.
Oh, I definitely think it has a lot of psychology in it. I'm starting to kind of build theories around why this episode was not liked as much. And I think I have a few ideas as to why, which we can talk about once we get through the episode. I think the episode is unique in that it stands apart. It doesn't feature one of the Gotham City Rogues Gallery villains. Mm-hmm. Certainly it does feature some villains, but they're not well known and they are very, very different than what we're used to. So we'll definitely talk about that.
Yeah, before we get to that, I want to bring up an email that was sent in from longtime listener Bernard O'Shea. He actually says that last week's episode, or the last episode we did, House and Garden, Drea, you said you felt that Batman thought the villains were beneath him and that he didn't trust them. And Bernard agrees. Batman does think the villains are beneath him. And on the evidence of previous episodes, some of the supporting cast as well. But, and this is what I think is very interesting, Bernard says, I think Batman reacts differently to people he feels are on his level, such as Ra's al Ghul. Have you noticed how Batman never brings Ra's to account for his misdemeanors? He never brings him to trial, unlike the other rogues. He is also content to allow him to scheme and plot until their next meeting. It's strange, do you not think? And he's got a point. Now, granted, Ra's al Ghul has always managed to escape Batman's capture at the end of each episode where we see him. But I've got to say that Bernard has an interesting point. If this had been any other villain, I think Batman would have been on top of it from the moment Ra's al Ghul ever lost, or left his sight.
Well, we realize that Ra's al Ghul is probably more powerful than any of the villains that we've covered, that he is supernatural. He has abilities that are superhuman and could potentially, he's a threat to not just the citizens of Gotham City, but globally. He is a high risk person. So I'm a little bit surprised that someone would think that Batman's lenient on him or treats him differently.
Well, now here's something that Bernard says, and I wanted to get your thought before reading this. He says, here's my theory, and this is why he thinks. Batman doesn't have a personality disorder, but he is an elitist. He may be out to save the day, but it's always his way. He is hard on those who he sees as being beneath him, but he has a respect for someone like Ra's, who is just as wealthy and resourceful as himself. They have a lot in common. My reasoning is based on what we have learned watching the show. Batman lost his parents in a tragedy, but he was already an elite member of society, so that will have formed his belief system, e.g., remember how Bruce acted at the end of The Forgotten. He is a philanthropist, but is it ever clear to what end? if he is saving the rainforest, is it for the benefit of Wayne Enterprises, pharmaceutical department? He's the world's greatest detective, but he chooses to let Ra's al Ghul run free. Could it be because he believes the world needs elite men like them to run it? Is Batman elitist?
I mean, we also have to think about the fact that Bruce Wayne is in love with Ra's daughter. So there is a triad, there's a triangle of emotional intensity there. He knows that she is quite loyal to her father, and that if he violates that trust in a way that might upset her, she could be gone forever. Now, there have been instances where this has been a hot and cold relationship. So it's not as if there's a strong loyalty to each other anyway. But I think that Talia Talia being a factor here, I think could be one of the reasons why Batman treats Ra's al Ghul a little differently. But I think what you said is true, that Ra's al Ghul gets away. He outsmarts Batman more times than not, and he has resources that Batman doesn't have, the supernatural resources, the even the wealth that Batman doesn't have, and the history and age that Batman doesn't have. Ra's al Ghul is 600 years old, so there's that sense of just the supernatural wisdom that he carries, that he's able to be on a different level. Right. So I don't know that it's this intended leniency or this intended treatment that's different. I just think that Ra's al Ghul is a completely different person than these other rogues gallery villains that kind of requires a different level of interaction.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it would be fascinating for Batman to know that Ra's al Ghul could be behind any corner. But in fairness to Batman, most of their encounters have ended with Batman having thought he was dead. So he wouldn't necessarily he wouldn't necessarily think that he was out there scheming and plotting. For all intents and purposes, Ra's al Ghul is no more. He might have something in the back of his head saying, it seemed a little easy knocking him into the Lazarus pit. But for the most part, Batman's always sort of thought Ra's al Ghul was gone. This time, after they left him stranded in the desert, they took the camels or horses or whatever, and they rode off. Batman was left there and just sort of kicked the dirt and was like, well, I guess I lost this one. He didn't really put up any kind of fight. So it was one of those situations where I could easily see someone thinking Batman knows this isn't over and that he's going to get his chance again. That being said, you would think that Batman would want this guy more than anyone else off the streets, or maybe even off the face of the planet, because he is so smart and he is so wealthy and he is so well connected, not only to earthly beings, but even supernatural abilities and things like that. So you would think that Batman, of all people, wouldn't want to play his elitist card on letting Ra's al Ghul go. You would think that he would really want to imprison that guy. But Bernard closes out by saying, I can see Andrea defending Batman to the hilt, but I would like to see what she says. Great work on the show. Looking forward to the terrible trio. It might even add something to the debate. And I think that's very true, because this episode is all about elitism to some degree. So I'm looking forward to jumping right in. What about you?
I agree. I actually disagree that this is about elitism, and I would say this is about entitlement, which we will talk about. But I do agree with you that this episode will enlighten us and lead us through some conversations around that personality trait.
Yeah. As you mentioned, this isn't your standard villain of the week. We've certainly seen a lot of the Rogues Gallery in the last few weeks. In fact, just a few weeks ago, we saw them all basically in one room putting Batman on trial. This is a trio of villains that we have not yet encountered in Batman the Animated Series. That being said, they're not new villains. Drea, were you ever familiar with the Terrible Trio pre-Batman the Animated Series or pre this episode?
No, I was not. I was not familiar with these characters until the animated series.
These characters were actually created in 1958.
What?
Yes. There have been various incarnations of the Terrible Trio before, but the original trio is very much like we see them here. You've got Gunther Hardwick, you've got Warren Lawford, and you got Armand Leidecker. And in the original incarnation of the Terrible Trio, they were famous inventors. And each one specialized in the land, sea, or air. Their gadgetry, their various inventions specialized on, whichever one they had. So it's interesting to see how they were able to turn them into the animated series versions where they're not necessarily inventors, but you do see them use their various land, air, sea gadgetry, and each one sort of specializes in the appropriate sort of gadget. So that was kind of cool. But yes, 1958.
It sounds like what they did is they took the characters and acculturated them to this more noir, dark animated show where, for the most part, you have normal citizens interacting with each other. So,
absolutely.
So the description you gave was a little bit more campy, a little bit more classic Batman, whereas this trio is fitting more with the animated series.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. These guys are a bit more realistic, but we'll get to this. Their motivation is right there on the edge of like sort of comic booky, cartoony, and maybe even the kind of thing that actually takes place out there in the world today. So let's talk about that. These three guys, each one wearing a different animal mask. You've got a fox who basically seems to be the leader. You've got a shark, and you've got a vulture. They enter into this to this building, and basically they're robbing it, as many episodes of Batman the Animated Series begin. There is a robbery. And what I like about this is, once again, we're dealing with a security guard who isn't necessarily the best of security guards. He's outmatched, for sure. They end up loading a lot of money into a bag. And what's really weird is, in this particular case, they do the math as to what this guy must be making an hour and what that must add up to in a year. And they offer him compensation for basically just turning around and not saying anything. And I thought that was interesting. What about you?
Well, this is our first look into their personalities, and you'll notice that they're already starting to rub us the wrong way, right? They're calculating how much somebody makes a year. They're putting a person's value. They're essentially sizing that person up based on their income. And
right.
while they're willing to compensate that person, that's how this really opens. So you're sort of clued into the idea that, like, not only are they stealing money, but their sense of value is around salaries, around what someone makes. It's what they're worth, literally, which makes for kind of an interesting personality dynamic for the three of them.
You get the sense that they don't need the money that they're stealing. There's an attitude about them that suggests that they actually have much more than this, that this is more of a game. This is never more evidenced than later on as Batman and Robin are making chase. They jump into a boat, they blow the pier up, knocking Robin into the water and maybe even knocking him unconscious. And as they flee, you hear,
"See? I told you this would be fun."
This is fun for them.
So nearly killing Robin, stealing a whole bunch of money, and getting away in a speedboat. That's their version of fun. That's what, gets them going.
Yeah. Well, I think Batman actually puts it best when he's back at the Batcave and he makes his own assessment.
predators of land, sea, and air.
Maybe they're experts in those areas.
The only thing these guys are experts in is arrogance.
Already they are the antithesis of what he's about. You know, obviously, when we think about Bruce Wayne, we think about a person who is a billionaire, has wealth, has access to resources, but he is not defined by that. Like Bruce, Batman, is not defined by that wealth, by that characteristic.
Right.
He knows he needs that in order to fulfill his role as Batman. But for him, that's not how we value lives. And I think that he is very put off by these guys who are devaluing people and not treating them with dignity and stealing from them for sport. And I think that's what is particularly upsetting for Batman. I think he's irritated by it, but he's also quite upset about the idea that somebody or a group of guys will violate someone's rights and violate their human dignities just for sport.
Well, it's funny that you mention human dignities and human rights, because moments later, Bruce is out at this charity event that he is hosting, and it's at one of the local fancy schmancy country club type places, and he is out shooting skeet with shotguns with 3 people. You've got you know they seem relatively young. They might even seem a little younger than Bruce. Would you say? You've got Warren, and then you've got Gunther, and you've got Army, and these guys seem like they're kind of contemporaries with Bruce in terms of being trust fund kids. But at the same time, they might seem a little more youthful. Would you say?
Yeah, they're definitely older than college age Dick Grayson, but perhaps younger than Bruce Wayne.
Right. And these guys are out shooting skeet, and Bruce mentions that really the kinds of things he likes to do for fun is, they're pretty boring compared to the adventurous type of things these guys have all done. They've done everything, and they throw it into Bruce's face. Meanwhile, of course, we know that Bruce is certainly more adventurous than any of them, or has at least accomplished more than any of them. But
yeah, do they have a giant penny? I don't think so.
And how would they wouldn't have gotten their giant penny the same way he would have. That's
you're going to go there.
That is for sure.
Well, I do have a nightlife.
He likes to boogie. Bruce makes it very clear that he's very philanthropic and that he's about charity and about people. And that's when they say something that's a little Drea, take a listen.
Do you thank the garbage man for picking up your trash?
If I happen to run into him.
Don't get Warren started, Bruce.
You know how he feels about the servants.
The servants? Oh my God, Bruce. Don't get him started on the servants. How do you feel about that, Drea?
Oh, they're so unlikable. I realize that they're hyperbole. There's a hyperbole about this. They're kind of exaggerated, but yeah, they're really, you're irritated by them. So speaking from the psychological perspective, we are like Bruce in the sense that we're irritated by their personalities. We are not just rubbed the wrong way, but we get this sense of grossness. Like, I don't want to be around these people. They're so arrogant. They're so narcissistic, and they devalue people who aren't like them. And so you get the sense that that they're entitled, that they feel like they deserve, or they automatically have earned more than other people on various levels, and that's not necessarily true. So I think at this point we're supposed to be incredibly irritated and put off by them, and at this point Bruce is starting to get suspicious.
Yeah, Warren, I might add too, seems to be the leader of the pack, And he is by far the most obnoxious of the three. And Drea, you know I'm going to say it, redhead. And bright redhead. I mean, like, he is straight up redhead. I mean, that's like poison ivy red.
He is redheaded, but his partner is blonde, and the tall guy of the trio is a brunette. So I wonder if it's just about like everybody.
But why
all
does
hair
the
color.
worst one? Why does the worst one have to be the redhead? Why does the guy who literally describes himself as a superior animal have to be? For starters, if you're a redhead, you know straight up that you're a superior animal, but you're never going to tell anyone that, and he does. Take a listen.
You must recognize that you are a superior animal, Bruce. A member of the elite.
So he's straight up saying that because they have the money, and because maybe their families have had the money and the power for so long, they are all members of the elite, and in fact are a superior class of people.
Right. And already there, we're starting to get uncomfortable with the way that they're talking about their lives and their lifestyles being a certain way and being essentially above others. Again, the entitlement, the belief that they deserve more than other people. And that, I mean, I'm getting the sense now that he's mentioned himself as a superior being, as a superior animal, that you're getting the implication, now this is a kid's show, but you're given the implication that now we're referring to a hierarchy of humanness, right? And that harkens back to different classes and races and ethnicities having believed to have different levels of humanness. So I don't like him one bit.
So this is when we meet one Sheldon Fallbrook, a very wealthy businessman, and he's got a daughter in a very sleek dress. She is very well dressed for this bunch, and her name is Rebecca, and she also happens to be Warren's girlfriend. And if you want to know what kind of people these are, when asked how much money her very sleek dress cost, she actually says it was $5,000. Now, Drea, let's just go ahead and assume that this episode took place in 1995 when it first aired. I mean, I think we've established that it's somewhere a little further back in time, but we don't quite know where. We're just going to say it was in 1995. I needed to know what that inflated cost would be today. And that $5,000 dress today would actually be a little over $7,800. Are there dresses that you wear
Yes.
to the country club like that?
Well,
little black numbers that are $7,800.
There are dresses that cost that much money, and they are wedding dresses. Well, I would say you could probably find a designer dress, a red carpet dress that's priced at that. I think that's an example of just how wealthy this family is.
I'd say it was worth it.
As they all catch a peek at all the goods. She's just flaunting that dress around. But she makes it clear that Daddy paid for it, but Daddy doesn't know. Daddy has a credit card out there somewhere that is being abused, and he doesn't know about it. But he's the kind of guy, too, who A, might be upset to find out that he's paying that much for a dress, but B, has the money to spend. So there's a definite difference between these people and the people we are used to seeing on the streets of Gotham City. You don't see these people on the sidewalks like we have seen in the last 70 some odd episodes.
This family reminds me of the couple that took the Penguin in to befriend him and later took advantage of him. They were part of this elite society. I would imagine that they know of this family.
Sure. Well, Warren agrees to pay for the dress. I mean, this is sort of a can't buy me love situation, right? Where he actually just takes out his billfold or his checkbook and he writes her a check for $5,000, hands it to her, and she says that she is going to put the money in her father's account since he's going to be out of town for a little while. And the two guys who are with him sort of jab him a little bit about this, and it's the sort of fraternity brother mentality that you're used to hearing in shows like this. And he says that he thinks that they might be able to get that money back and then some. Well, we're not entirely sure what he means, but then we actually go, and that's when we see at night the terrible trio are back in their masks, breaking in to Fallbrook's house or a condo or apartment, whatever it is.
At this point, it's without question that the three guys that we met with Bruce Wayne, this is the terrible trio. These are the three guys that are the thieves.
Mm-hmm. This is where we start to see sort of the strength of the chain between these three.
I don't know about this. It's one thing to steal from strangers, but we know Fallbrook.
Yes, adds a bit of extra spice, doesn't it?
So so one of the guys is expressing a sense of remorse, almost a sense of empathy, right? We know this guy, you're dating his daughter, it seems wrong. It seems like there is a line that he'll draw in the sand of morality, right? Whereas Gunther Goose redheaded dude, Warren
Fox
shows little signs of understanding that moral sense. In other words, knowing the person who we're about to rob, knowing the person who we're violating, it doesn't impact his decision to violate him.
Well, yes and no. And this is a question that I have for you. Over these last 70 some episodes, Drea, we've discussed things like behavioral disorders and mental disorders and, various things. You've brought up things like antisocial personality disorder. You've brought up borderline disorder. You've talked about people who do not make emotional connections to others or may sense inaccurate emotional connections. They might see bonds that aren't there or, whatever. I've got to ask about a guy who literally has not only no remorse for what he's about to do or what he's doing at this moment, and certainly what he's done to other people in Gotham City, but he is now getting more excited about robbing someone he knows. Like, this is now going back to that time that you said
what time? I did what?
That time that you were talking about criminals and the slippery slope of if I can get away with this, now I'll bump it up. And you get the sense that like Warren is now feeling a high he's never felt because he didn't know those people before, and now he's wiping out somebody that he is very close to. Not only that, he's dating the guy's daughter and robbing him blind. And I've got to ask what your thoughts are about someone who can do this and receive that kind of high.
Well, you mentioned lack of empathy or inability to connect to other people's emotions, and I want to be very clear that that is one particular trait, which could be a symptom of a mental disorder. But that trait in isolation does not give us enough information. That is not enough for us to say one way or another that he has a particular mental disorder. We would need more information. But I would agree with you. At this point, we're not just seeing lack of empathy, lack of understanding for someone else who might be suffering. We're also seeing this deliberate decision, this interest in violating someone's rights, and an increased high around that. So we've talked about this before in the show. He may very well be high on the trait of sensation seeking or risk taking. Again, that is one area, one trait that we can piece together for his profile, if you will, but maybe not enough information to decide if he's meeting for a diagnosis. So I want to be careful with our quickness to jump to something. And there's a reason why I'm saying this now.
Okay. All right. Well, as they are in the process of robbing Fallbrook, Sheldon actually bursts into the room. He was supposed to be gone, and he
Wait, who's Sheldon?
Fallbrook. Sheldon Fallbrook.
Oh, the old man.
Yes, the old man bursts into the room with a rifle and is ready to gun down the would-be thieves. He tries to call the police, but the gang ends up sort of taking control. They knock the gun out of his hands, and then Warren ends up really rather brutally beats Fallbrook. And I think he basically does it so that we can see a particular pinky ring that he's wearing, or a particular ring. It's sort of a fraternity brother kind of ring with an interesting insignia. And clearly this ring is going to leave a mark of some kind on Fallbrook's face. But I applaud, if that's the right word, the use of this, for the writers and animators. Like they literally wrote into a script that Fallbrook gets punched in the face and a mark is left on it, and that's how Batman ends up finding them later. I mean, spoiler alert.
Yeah, that's dark.
But I mean, that's pretty brutal.
You won't see that on an animated show today.
The trio ends up leaving. They take some things from him, including like a stick pin it looks like there's a diamond on it, and they end up leaving, and the Batmobile ends up chasing after them. But Batman has an interesting assessment about these guys after all this goes down. Trey, tell me what you think.
Scoundrels like these are worse than the Joker. At least he's got madness as an excuse.
So he brings up a point, and this is why I think this episode is at times disliked. I think this is the reason this episode is necessary, because you have a villain or a group of villains enacting these crimes, violating people's rights, and showing off their evil ways, and you have no grounds for that. You don't have a history of trauma or isolation or negative bad parenting or bullying or some kind of incident, or what we would consider an adverse event. You don't have multiple adverse events that a psychologist would say, this story leads me to understand that this person has learned these unfortunate ways of dealing with their world. What you have instead are what we call non-pathological aversive personalities. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that none of their characteristics are leading me down a path to point to a particular diagnosis or mental health disorder. Instead, what we have are these three guys who are showing these traits that are what we would consider like subclinical, non-pathological personality traits that you and I would sit here and say, that's pretty aversive. That's we would say that they're unlikable. We would say that we dislike them as humans. But would we say that they have a mental disorder? Well, let's review. What is a mental disorder? We have to remind ourselves that a mental disorder isn't simply something that we find abnormal and we don't like it. Okay? A mental disorder has to be a behavioral or psychological syndrome a person shows that causes that person significant distress or impairment in an area of functioning. Area of functioning means their relationships or their job or their academic functioning, so one important area in their lives. So distress, impairment, and some kind of behavioral, psychological, cognitive problem.
Okay.
We're not seeing that with these guys. We're the ones who are irritated, right? We're the ones feeling kind of distressed around them, but they're not showing signs of that. Now, one could argue like, well, they're clearly their relationships, their impairments have to do with the people around them. Their relationships are poor, but we aren't even getting enough evidence for that yet.
Gotcha.
So it's actually a strikingly almost social comment that Batman's making here, that these guys are straight up criminals. They're violating the law. They're participating in thievery and violence for their own, giggles, for their own self-related needs, and they're not suffering. Whereas other folks, like the Joker, who is an extreme example, perhaps, yes, has participated in atrocities and has violated people's rights, but we've come to a point where we understand that he is probably suffering. He is probably very impaired.
So I have a question. As I was reading about this, sometimes I go looking for things that are true to life and, whatever. And while I didn't necessarily find, yes, we have certainly seen stories in the past where rich kids are robbing other rich people. I'm wondering specifically about an article that I read where a psychologist was suggesting that sometimes rich kids like this, it can be considered maybe even abusive how little they have to endure in life. There are no hardships, and that can be considered abusive or maybe even traumatizing on a different degree. And I thought that you might, take issue with that, given the description of trauma that they are using. It seems very light, but at the same time, while I wouldn't necessarily use those words, I can see the point that she was trying to make, which was that you are doing a great injustice to these people by not letting them experience hardships in life. Like these people literally are treating other people like children burning ants with magnifying glasses. They don't understand that what they're doing is wrong.
I think they do understand that what they're doing is wrong.
Yeah.
I agree that they have few opportunities to experience adversity and challenges, and so they don't know what it's like. Therefore, they have a more challenging time empathizing with people who are disadvantaged or people that are not as privileged as they are. But to suggest that they do not understand the wrongfulness of their actions, I think is to miss the point that I had made earlier, that there's no sign here, there's no evidence here that they don't have that cognitive emotional ability.
Sure.
I think that certainly they are so self-centered and narcissistic that their ability to understand other people's suffering is impacted by their lifestyle or how they were raised or how they were socialized. But I truly believe that they know what they're doing is wrong. And in fact, the wrongfulness is what gives them excitement.
Yes. I think you're absolutely right. They do. I misspoke. They absolutely do know it's wrong. They just don't care in the same way that, somebody might hurt an animal and know it's wrong but not care. Like I don't know. I thought this article was interesting, though misguided. But I wanted to bring it up since we were dealing with something like this. This was actually in response partially to the very real case of the Bling Ring, which I'm sure we've all heard about at this point. There was even a movie made about it a couple of years ago, where it was a bunch of basically debutante and very wealthy kids who decided to befriend like Paris Hilton, and they went to her house and they ended up robbing it. And they were stealing from rich people in order to sell to basically other rich people. So it reminded me a lot of this. And when asked why they were doing it, basically they were just bored, which sounds a bit like something we hear as the episode progresses. They have avoided Batman by throwing cash out of the back of the car. So clearly they didn't even need the cash they were stealing. And the daughter of Fallbrook actually ends up going and visiting her father at the hospital. She is not in on this. We should make that very clear. She is an innocent bystander in all of this, not a member of the trio in any way, which again, I will applaud the writers for. It would be very easy to make her part of it, to make her, a bad girl. In this case, as bad as she gets, she spends a lot of her dad's money.
Right.
But she's not a villain Rebecca ends up going to the hospital, and she's visiting her father as he, as he's laying there, and Bruce is there, and that's when he discovers the mark on Fallbrook's face, and realizes who must be behind this. And basically, Warren and the other members of the trio are out at this it's like sort of a cabin, almost hunting house, like a retreat type house, and they are discussing everything that is going on, and she finds out what's happened, and unfortunately, Warren is under the impression that she's going to go and she's going to talk. And he becomes very abusive toward her. Now, this is, again, where his two friends decide to, sort of take a different approach. They think it's now gone across, the line. And Warren ends up saying something that I find, again, really kind of damning when it comes to his character, which is...
This is getting extreme. There are limits to...
Haven't you listened to anything I've told you? We are beyond limitations, beyond restriction.
I mean, they are beyond restriction, Drea.
But they're not, which is kind of funny. They still have options. And this is a scene that actually, when I watched this again, realized just how upsetting it is, and even triggering, like for real. I know we've talked about triggering as like, oh, the word trigger is overused and people use trigger warnings and we're constantly oversensitive. And that scene, I think, is particularly terrifying because you have this young woman who's almost held, like at this point she's held hostage in this cabin, out isolated in the woods with these three guys. These three guys have already committed these crimes and have told her that she's just discovered that they're the ones who have committed these crimes, and they're contemplating how they are going to react to this. They're contemplating their decision around how to keep her quiet, and they're surrounding her. And the main guy, Warren, who's her boyfriend, is increasingly...
I don't know that he is anymore.
Well, no.
Yeah.
No. Who was her boyfriend? He becomes increasingly aggressive. His voice is irritated and it gets very loud. And it's one of those scenes where the two other guys are unsure about whether they want to move further, and
right.
He's convincing them to move further.
Yeah, they're not having the fun that he is having in this moment, and they don't feel as threatened about their fun coming to an end as he feels. And he feels like she absolutely has to be taken care of. In fact, they're going to end up chloroforming her and throwing her into the back of a car and throwing it off a cliff, basically. And they're not really down for that. I mean, they're going to do it. But they're not down for that. And what I found to be, frankly terrifying was their reasoning that they gave Rebecca for doing this. Like, she didn't understand why. And Warren comes right out and says it.
Because we were bored. Don't you get it? It was a game.
I mean, to him, this is all a very simple thing. It's we can't be stopped. We are above that. We have like the law in our pockets. We are above everyone else. Again, it goes back to we are the elite.
Well, in the boredom piece, right? You get the sense that unlike most citizens, they don't have to work, right? They don't have the challenges, the adversity, the decision making that the rest of us have to make. We are anxious. We are stressed. We are, even for those who make a decent living, you have to make important decisions around that. When all of those stressors are lifted, it's very possible that the boredom becomes something that needs to be addressed. And this is what he decides to engage in to get rid of that boredom. But I think, you mentioned what happens to her. you do get the sense immediately that she's about to be victimized. And,
Yes.
and that's what I meant by this is a very scary moment. And like you said, they end up drugging her and pushing her off a cliff in a car. And the intent there is murder.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
that. Obviously, Batman saves her, but that's the idea.
Well, and it's like you had said before, you cross one boundary, you realize you've not been caught, you kind of want to cross another boundary. They beat the crap out of Fallbrook, didn't kill him, but put him in the hospital, and now they're going a step further. Or I shouldn't say they, Warren. The redhead is going the step further, and you almost feel like this is just one more thing that he thinks he can get away with, and it makes you wonder what he would end up doing if he wasn't caught moments later by the Batwing catching the car, and Batman ends up pursuing him, and they're all eventually caught, but even when they're caught, Warren thinks he can still get out of it. I mean, he's trying to bribe Batman. And he's explaining that by arresting me, you are not going to win because, I've got the judges, I've got the police. I'm going to get out. Of course, then it cuts to him going into a rather scary jail cell with a very large cellmate who doesn't seem happy about his presence. And it's a bit ominous because you don't really, is it because, and Warren is scared for the first time in the entire episode. He is terrified by this cellmate.
One could argue this may be the first time he's legitimately scared, that he's anxious, that he's stressed.
Yeah, maybe ever in his life.
Yeah.
And so you sort of, you don't know what he's scared of exactly. Is that guy going to pummel him one way or pummel him another way? We don't know. This very well could be the first time he's ever been scared. And he's not as exhilarated by it as maybe.
That's a good point. This is legitimate fundamental fear and novelty, right?
Yeah, he has been into the risk, jumping out of planes and doing other, risk-taking things. And he even boasted about his lifestyle earlier in the episode, but never has he necessarily been scared by any of these things because he's been invincible. He's not invincible in this cell. Let's talk about this now that we've gone through the episode. What do you have to say about these guys, and what would you do if you had to go and visit Warren in his jail cell every week, as he's in prison? By the way, note, you don't see the other two. It's all about Warren in prison. I mean, I'm guessing that they are probably also incarcerated, but this story is certainly all about him getting his comeuppance.
Right. And again, I think that the comment here, maybe by the writers, is that there are certain kinds of people that do not have our sympathy because of the adversity, the trauma, the neurobiological predisposition for mental illness. These are folks that engage in violent and criminal acts simply for the high of it, without regard for other people's rights and dignities. And I think there is an intention here to show them as high society and to not give them that any kind of backstory or history or origin where we would experience some sympathy for them. So my direction with this is that thus far there aren't any symptoms here. I'm not seeing anything that tells me there's a diagnostic impression. In fact, you may argue, or someone may say, like, well, what about violating other people's rights? What about murder? What about homicide? What about attempted kill? That those things in and of themselves do not indicate a mental health disorder. And this, without getting too political, this is what we're seeing in the media, where these things do happen. These violent crimes and mass shootings do happen, and there's little evidence of actual mental health disorders or symptoms, but there's a quickness to draw that out and to connect it to mental illness. I'll say that's enough about that. For Warren, what I was thinking about was the dark triad of personality traits.
Oh, I see what you did there.
Yeah?
Triad, right?
Triad.
Okay.
So the dark triad essentially is a theory about personality traits. And as we talked about before, these personality traits overall are what we would consider non-pathological aversive personalities in particular. In other words, these aren't mental disorders. These are socially aversive personalities. Yucky, icky people we don't like, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Clinically, or I should say psychologically, what that means is that in the dark triad in particular, there are 3 personality traits that have been studied. One is the narcissistic personality trait, which it is sort of self-defined. Narcissism is grandiosity, thinking the person thinking that they're better than other people.
Check.
I want to be clear that this is normal narcissism. Normal, again, subclinical, not pathological, not narcissistic personality disorder, which is a mental health disorder.
Okay.
So normal narcissism, grandiosity, entitlement, dominance, superiority. Check, 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 check.
Yes.
The other and separate personality trait is Machiavellianism, which you've heard before, I'm sure.
The Prince.
It's a manipulative personality.
Yes.
Is that the Prince?
Machiavelli was a diplomat, a politician, a philosopher. He's basically the guy that we consider the father of modern day political science. A lot of really interesting thoughts on politics that people actually still use today. And wrote a book called The Prince, which was basically his rule book for how to rule a kingdom. Much of what we know today of Machiavellian politics, keep your friends close but your enemies closer, that is straight up Machiavelli.
Got it. So cold, manipulative, controlling. The third trait is subclinical psychopathy. So in plain English, high impulsivity, thrill-seeking. This is what we've seen, right? Non-pathological thrill-seeking. Now, the reason it's called the dark triad is that psychologists have theorized that this is actually one giant trait, that they're named separate things, but they overlap so much that this is actually a combination of traits that describes a certain type of person. A person, and I'm reading from this paper, a socially malevolent character with behavior tendencies toward self-promotion, emotional coldness, duplicity, and aggressiveness. Does that describe Warren?
Yes.
So one could argue that these 3 guys have varying levels of what we would call the dark triad, with Warren probably being higher on the psychopathy trait, on being more apt to violate others' rights and even be harmful toward others. All 3 are somewhat low anxiety, disagreeable, socially aversive, like other people find them socially aversive, but he is the one who shows more signs of breaking the law, of violating rights, of enacting more dangerous and potentially homicidal behavior. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
And in addition to destructiveness, the one thing that aligns these 3 character traits is entitlement. So let's talk about entitlement a little bit, because this is how we open the show.
Okay.
What is psychological entitlement? It's the belief that one should get preferential treatment, that they should be treated differently than other people just because.
Okay.
Right? And entitlement isn't just its own thing. It's associated with a whole bunch of other traits that makes entitlement particularly interesting. For instance, people who are entitled tend to have an external locus of control. meaning that they believe that the environment, that luck, that other external factors are usually responsible for their futures. And usually those futures are good, positive outcomes for them. They also, in terms of gender, males tend to have more psychological entitlement than women. And part of this could be the socialization of the male gender, that like these guys, they may believe that they should be paid more than women. They believe that they have more rights than women. They believe that they're just the way in which these guys, especially Warren, treats his female partner, you get the sense that he feels like he is better than she. And folks with psychological entitlement tend to score low on the trait agreeableness. They tend to be more disagreeable, and they tend to score low on emotional stability. So more unpredictable emotional presentations. And we saw, I think it was that last clip you played, where Warren gets really upset, irritated, and sounds very threatening. I think we can see that there.
Yes.
So I gathered this evidence-based psychological entitlement scale.
Okay.
And I would like you to take this scale, Brian.
Oh,
I would like you to
right.
take this test.
Yes.
Why don't I just, very short, why don't I just read them, and maybe quietly to yourself, you can agree, feel neutral about it, disagree, strongly disagree. You can just think about that in your own head.
Okay. And I encourage the listeners to do the exact same. You know, maybe even jot it down, and you can tally up your scores at the end.
Mm-hmm. Number 1, I honestly feel I'm just more deserving than others.
Okay.
Number 2, great things should come to me.
Mm-hmm.
Number 3, if I were on the Titanic, I would deserve to be on the first lifeboat.
Not just a lifeboat, but the first one.
The first. Number 4, I demand the best because I'm worth it. Number 5, I do not necessarily deserve special treatment. Number 6, I deserve more things in my life. Number 7, people like me deserve an extra break now and then. Number 8, things should go my way. Number 9, I feel entitled to more of everything.
Well, it's weird because maybe it's the way that you're reading them, or it's the way that they're written. These sound like daily affirmations. Like, this is almost the secret. This is like, you know what? I deserve a little more of everything. I deserve to be treated better.
Right.
You know, like, you know, I see that this is meant to be a negative if you score highly on this. But a lot of these, I'd be like, yeah, you know what? I do deserve a day off from time to time.
Well, and that is why it's a spectrum. You know, this is a scale that you could score low, medium, high. There's a range. And this was developed by Keith Campbell over in the University of Georgia. And it is found to be valid. It's a evidence-based, psychologically valid, psychometrically valid scale that measures entitlement. So, one to keep in your pocket, folks, if you're worried that you might be too entitled.
Drea, what'd you think of this episode?
I know it's not people's favorite. I know that clearly Bruce Timm himself has said this is not a good episode.
Allegedly.
Allegedly.
Again, if you can find that original interview or whatever, please send it in, because I would like to know.
That's right.
Yes.
We want a citation for that. But frankly, I think it offers something. And that's a reminder that some people have aversive personalities, and there's no mental illness or mental health problem to identify there. It is what it is.
Yeah. And I think it's a great episode. If not, I mean, it is very simple. These guys aren't necessarily super villains, although they do have cool gadgets. They are willing to blow things up, just like the Joker is. They do have elements there. The sense of entitlement might be why people like Bruce Timm hate this episode, because it's just sort of like, well, they're not really villains. They're just sort of dill holes. But I think for our purposes, this was a great episode. I love when we get an opportunity to see real people doing really bad things and we get to analyze them.
Right. There's so much stigmatization of persons with mental health problems that we have. Again, it's good to see that that is not the explanation for some bad behavior. So I appreciate the episode. I would like to see more cosplay of the Terrible Trio.
That could be cool. That could be cool. Drea, I will bring up one point, and I don't want to dwell on it, but we have sort of talked about Batman and his maybe his intentional lack of use in with Robins in the past, where it's been like, oh, well, I could have used Robin when I was desperately in need of assistance or whatever, and you've been like, oh, well, he believes only he can do it, whatever. Robin breaks his arm in that explosion, and
Right.
And Robin is still given the opportunity to fly the Batwing or hover the Batwing over with a broken arm, and he even lets Batman hear about it.
Take over.
Sure. Leave me to steer with a broken arm.
Is Batman recovering? Like, is he getting better at using Robin for these things?
This is
or-
actually going to this is going to be confirming for Batman not to bring the kid along because he's gotten hurt.
Oh, ooh. So maybe staying up there and steering the Batwing is actually punishment.
I think that's punishment.
Like, oh, stay up there, steer the Batwing.
Yeah, use your one good arm and steer.
Hey, I'm sorry. Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier with broken ribs and an arm that wouldn't work.
I don't know.
So,
who is that?
Drea, until next week, where can these awesome folks find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc. My website is underthemaskonline.com.
And you can find me on Twitter. I am at bward028. You can find us both. We definitely love hearing from folks and responding to folks over on Twitter at Arkham Sessions. You can also email us. We are arkhamsessions@gmail.com. Definitely go over to fanboycomics.net and visit our family over there. Listen to all of their awesome podcasts and check out their really fantastic comics. And be sure to look for appearances. We've got a couple coming up here in the next couple of weeks. So it should be awesome. Until next week, I am Brian Ward.
Don't forget to buy your Star Wars Force Awakens tickets.
Oh my God, you're incorrigible.
And I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And together we are
The Arkham Sessions.
I'd say it was worth it.